We're out of our breakout rooms here now, and we're now moving on to economic development and the corresponding questions around alternatives to economic development having to do with housing, fair wages, education, and attention to our children. Ron Deutsch, who is with New Yorkers for Fiscal Fairness. I don't know, Ron, if you made it on here yet. Okay. So the reason Ron is not on with us right away is that he is, as we speak, speaking to a panel in front of the Senate about economic development, and they got very backed up. So what I'm going to do is hope that Ron comes in a little bit later into this conversation, but we're going to focus on the end and then go back to the beginning. So let me just set this up by saying that one approach that we take to revitalizing our economy is to provide tax breaks to people at the top and hope that the tax benefit will trickle down to everybody else. And perhaps this particular theory is enshrined in some of the work that's done through the Empire Development Corporation, Empire State Development Corporation, which provides all kinds of tax incentives for companies to relocate, to hire people, to build new facilities, and to give them basically tax incentives to do that. Some of those have worked okay. A lot of them have not, and have a lot of times been riddled with instances of corruption. And some people have actually even gone to jail for this. Maybe one of our more high-profile examples would be the Buffalo Billion, where $750 million was put into building a solar factory in the state of Buffalo, the city of Buffalo, which was going to employ maybe 2,500 people. It turns out that maybe half of the promised employees were actually hired, if not less, and it did not at all deliver on what was promised. And there wasn't a lot of disclosure or transparency about what was promised and how they did. So what Ron Deutsch and his friends at New York for Fiscal Fairness and a whole bunch of others are saying is that we need to be able to redirect some of our money that we give to these kinds of investments and put them more into bottom-up kinds of investments to strengthen the safety net, and at the same time have more transparency about how we do spend our economic development dollars to ensure that everyone can see how these dollars are spent and what was promised. So Ron is going to expand on that a little bit more if he should come on, but we are really blessed to have with us today two people. Rachel Fee, who is really the best expert I know in the state of New York on the role of affordable housing and its importance, and also Dee Dee Hill, who is the political director at the Schuyler Center, who's going to speak to the questions around how we provide for our children. And so just one more statement I would just say is that we think the better economic approach in our state that should be taken is to really help reduce the burden on people's household incomes. That will release more dollars into the economy, we think, and make a more appreciable difference in the lives of average New Yorkers than giving large tax breaks at the top. So what we're really proposing is a bottom-up kind of economic approach, a build back better kind of approach for New York as a way to really care for people who are struggling and to revitalize our economy. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rachel and have her lay out the landscape a little bit around affordable housing.
Great, thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here today and talk about affordable housing in this frame of economic development. And thanks for that intro, because I think we should be thinking about this as economic development from the ground up. And there are so many ways we could be doing a better job of that around housing issues. So before I get into sort of, what's happening in New York with current proposals, I just wanted to talk about how we have research that really shows how investment can make a difference, helping people on a personal level afford their rent, but also how that impacts the economy. So New York Housing Conference, we're a statewide affordable housing policy and advocacy organization. We've been thinking a lot about universal rental assistance and just this huge need we have in New York that obviously everybody has been talking about since the COVID pandemic started, but really has been an underlying issue in New York for years, housing insecurity. So we did this report looking at, well, what if we did have universal rental assistance? What would that mean for New York? And across the nation, 17 million households would benefit if we had a real housing safety net at the federal level. And that means helping people pay their rent so that they're not paying more than 30% of their rent and they could afford other basic needs. And in New York, that would mean that 1.1 million households would benefit. Those are low-income households that are right now rent burdened, paying too much on their rent. And this was a campaign promise from President Biden. He talked about this concept on the campaign trail. And right now across the nation, about 1 in 4 eligible households receive rental assistance, but it's only 1 in 4 because the federal government short funds the program. We've never had enough funding to help everybody who is in need. But if we did have universal rental assistance, that would lift about 9.3 million Americans out of poverty. So, I think you've heard this idea of like the rent eats first, like that's literally what's happening in these 9.3 million households across the country. So, just to get into like, what it means to think differently about economic impact and housing policy, if those households were helped, given some assistance paying their rent each month, it would free up $7,680 in income, which our research shows would be spent on crazy things like food, childcare, and transportation. What's interesting also is like, you don't really think, okay, if we help someone pay their rent, there's these economic spin-offs, but there are. So our study found that it would create 96,000 jobs and 5 billion in increased earnings. So it's really significant. So there is this knock-on effect of helping invest in communities and families who are struggling right now. So it feels like a little bit of a pipe dream proposal at the moment, since negotiations around Build Back Better have stalled in Washington. But I do think we're making a strong case, and there is newfound urgency around our housing crisis. So I do feel like we are going to see more opportunities to expand rental assistance at the federal level. But I don't think it's going to be this year, unfortunately. So that's investing, in households to help pay their rent. I also wanted to talk about what it means if you expand access to housing. So there's been some really interesting research showing that if a household moves to a lower poverty neighborhood, it can increase earnings, lifetime earnings for a child. I think this is the Raj Chetty work that shows $300,000 in increased earnings over a lifetime. That's just by moving to a lower poverty neighborhood, not even like the best neighborhood, the highest income neighborhood. So really, even, increasing access to housing is such an important part of our housing policy, which I don't think, at the state level, we've spent enough time thinking about. And then I feel like this one is a little bit more obvious, but creating more affordable housing, that's new construction of affordable housing, also creates jobs. It creates economic stimulus. So for every 100 units of affordable housing, it creates 120 construction jobs, 135 indirect and induced jobs, and 43.5 million in economic spending. So there are benefits to investing in housing. It helps the family in need, but also these kind of, other economic effects. So what's on the table? I'll just kind of talk about that for a moment. Right now at the state level, Governor Hochul has proposed a $4.5 billion statewide housing plan over 5 years. That would create about 100,000 units, building some new and preserving some. What's not in her budget is assistance for those many renters who we know were impacted by COVID, unable to pay their rent, have significant arrears, have applied to the state through the emergency rental assistance program, and they just ran out of money. So, it's great to think about investment in housing moving forward, but we also know that we have this extreme need of people that need help today. So I just want to put out there that is absent from the budget right now. And, for those of you that are in New York City, that our New York City public housing is in dire need of investment. This is another area that is just completely left out of the budget. So the governor had talked about her interest in supporting NYCHA, the New York City Housing Authority, and promised to put together a task force. But, this has not been identified as a priority in the budget so far. So those would be areas we're looking for as this budget negotiation happens in Albany, of making some changes. So what is in the budget, that 4.5 billion, also comes with some proposals, which I think are really promising proposals, to think about how we can combat exclusionary zoning in the state. So there's really two things needed there. Like, one is investment in a new affordable housing, but the other is unlocking those opportunities to create sites to add more multifamily, where right now it's not allowed. So Peter, I don't know how much more detail you'd like at this stage, but I'd be happy to stop there if that was enough of an overview for you.
Great. I'm why don't we turn to Dee Dee, and then we're definitely going to circle back with a lot of questions. Why don't we take a couple for Rachel right now, and then we'll go to Dee Dee, and then we'll come back and take a few more for everyone. Okay. A couple questions for Rachel. Could you talk a little bit about this the situation with ERAP and evictions, and what you know about what additional money might be coming our way?
Sure. So about $2 billion has been allocated by the state of New York. They are still processing many of the applications. I think there's about, I'm going to get the number wrong. There are thousands of applications that have not been matched, that the tenant has applied for the funds and have not been matched with their landlord yet. So fully approved. So there's a portion of that $2 billion that's just being held there in this process, which I think is very frustrating for both the tenants and the landlords. We met with the OTDA last week, and they told us at the time that the agency only has enough money to process applications that came through the first week of September. Now, the portal for emergency rental assistance was open for several months after that. It was closed, and then it was reopened, and we saw tens of thousands of new applications come in. So the need is dire. The governor estimated it at about another 1.6 billion. But I don't think they have a strong handle on exactly what the price tag is of what's outstanding and who's just left, holding this bill that they have no ability to pay. So I do expect that we'll get a small additional amount from the federal government in March when there's some redistribution of unused funds. In December, the federal government gave another 30 million. I think it's going to be something in that kind of realm, but we're unsure. So that leaves us with, something like 1.5 billion in outstanding rent arrears. And I think it's a really serious situation. Governor Hochul's budget identified a $2 billion pandemic reserve surplus. And, we're advocating that fund is used to address rent arrears for these applicants that have been waiting a really long time. So I am hopeful that additional state funds will be allocated and that the legislature is really going to advocate for this as well. But, exactly where we land, it's unclear.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, I would like to know, have they increased the vouchers for people to rent the city? I believe it's the city. The vouchers that they give the people in the
city
shelters.
Right.
Yeah. So city FEPs, the kind of top rent that they can, the top limit on the voucher was increased by this I guess it was a bill that was signed by the governor in the autumn. I actually don't know the full status of how that has been implemented. So I could put my info in the chat if that's something you wanted to follow up with, but the limit was increased. I just don't know how it's been rolled out. And we do know that, it's been really difficult for families, especially those leaving shelter with a voucher, to utilize it. And I know in Section 8, which is the program that's really thought of as the kind of, gold standard for rental assistance from the landlords because it's backed by the federal government. And, it's like a known program with known rules, and reliable. Even in that program, it's about the rate that a person with the success rate of using a voucher ranges somewhere between 75% and like 66%, something like this. So that means that not every person that uses a voucher is even successful. Sorry, every person that gets a voucher is not even successful in using it to rent an apartment. That they face discrimination. There's a lack of housing supply. There's, so many challenges. So the rental assistance program you're referring to, City FEPS, I think has an even more difficult time in getting used and accepted by landlords, even with source of income discrimination legislation on the books. So I think that increase is really going to help make it more successful, but families are still going to face difficulty.
Is there a plan being worked out? Because I heard that a lot of landlords, they don't want to take the voucher. They always got excuse, no kids, no animals. And it came across me. So I was discussing it when the people in, I believe it was the Bronx, they got burnt out. Red Cross put them in a hotel, now they're in a shelter. And I have someone that's in Brooklyn, a real estate person, and he asking for help. And he just was telling me, he said he's having such a problem, even with the immigrants, trying to find placement for them. And they come with family, a lot of them.
Yeah. It's an ongoing issue, discrimination against rental assistance as a source of income. So I think more has to be done on public education because it is against the law to refuse rental assistance. But then I think, part of it is education, part of it is enforcement, right? The landlords don't get in trouble for saying no enough. And I think we need more enforcement as well. And then I do think on the landlord side, the process also needs to just go more smoothly. Like you shouldn't have to wait to get paid, a month, 2 months, 3 months. Like that's a barrier for many small landlords and kind of also like the reason many don't want to participate. So, I think there's a lot we need to do to improve the program, but increasing that City FEPS limit was kind of the first step, as you pointed out.
Yes, and also with the covenant, and a lot of people didn't get paid, a lot of landlord, and plus people they lost their job. You know how much stress that put on the landlord? Because he's still got to make that mortgage payment.
Sure. Right. It's not just renters who've been stressed during this period, certainly plenty of landlords as well.
All right. Thanks, everyone. We're going to move on to Ron Deutsch, who has just joined us now. Ron, you're here. Okay, welcome, Ron. You're in from the wilds of the legislature, so glad to have you here. So basically, I briefly mentioned the shortcomings of economic development, and it had Rachel talk about the importance of affordable housing as an alternative to economic development as it's often conceived in the state. And we were just waiting next to have Dee Dee speak to the same question. So Ron, what I'd like you to do is take just a few minutes to top line your case around the problem with economic development and some of the bills to expose transparency, have more transparency And then I want to give Dee Dee plenty of time to be able to speak to the children question.
Sure. Thank you very much for having me here today. And I do apologize. I really wanted to be here on time for this. But the economic development hearing, to say it was going long would be an understatement. I was on the first panel and they took 3 hours to talk to the commissioner. So anyway, I am glad to be here with you. So I guess I've been working on economic development for the last 30 years or so in Albany. And I have to say that it's just, long past time to kind of reevaluate, reform, redefine, and yes, reallocate funds from our failed system of economic development, because as we know, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is, well, let's just say it's not the right approach, as you all know. And we have such a heavy reliance on tax incentives as an economic development strategy. And sadly, after decades, there's little to show beyond this kind of trail of political scandals, bad deals, empty buildings, hundreds of millions in equipment nobody's going to use. And study after study has really shown that these programs are not cost effective and don't provide the return on investment that were promised. So some of the things that we need to do in order to make sure that we shore up our system of economic development and have greater transparency and accountability, first and foremost, I'd say, we need a comprehensive database that tracks all state funding that is awarded in the name of economic development. And as you can see from the paper, Senator Comrie and Assemblymember Wallace have bills that would accomplish both of these things. The state came out with a database of economic incentives, which we think sorely misses the mark. And that database really fails to actually define what is a job. So, we don't know if these jobs are permanent or temporary, full or part-time, catering jobs. And there's really no way to complete this kind of apples to apples comparison of these programs to find out if we're getting a good return on our investment. So I think we desperately need to make sure that we get a solid accounting of the monies that are going out the door, and the state's, the state's database of economic incentives just doesn't meet that mark. We also need to make sure that we restore the pre-audit powers that the state comptroller had. You may remember back in 2011, when a gentleman named Andrew Cuomo took office as governor, he basically removed the pre-audit powers that the comptroller had by adding language to a variety of different appropriations bills. But there's currently in this budget about $10 billion that's not subject to comptroller review. And this is a real corruption risk, right? Had the comptroller had these powers, we're talking about him like he's a superhero, but if he had these powers, they would have caught the Buffalo Billion scandal and stopped it in its tracks, rather than having that blow up into one of the greatest economic development debacles in the state. So, the comptroller, he's the state's duly designated and elected fiscal watchdog, and he should be able to review all contracts to safeguard the public's funding. We've also been calling for a ban on local IDAs, county, city, and towns from giving away school district money. So that's another thing that really needs to be addressed. Schools across the state lost about 406, actually in upstate alone, and not including the big 5 school districts, lost about over $400 million in 2020 to economic development abatements, pilots, and whatnot. So our schools are really suffering, and when we know those schools need the money, and quite frankly, the areas with the biggest abatements of school taxes also tend to be low-income communities and communities of color. So we've been shortchanging many of these schools for a long time at the state level, and it's also happening at the local level. So those are a couple, they're all in your informational packet as to the other asks that we're making. But I do want to say too, I know Dee Dee's going to talk about why childcare should be viewed as economic development, and it absolutely should. But I want to talk just for a second about why home care also should be viewed as economic development, right? We have an aging population that is facing a massive home care shortage over the next decade, which is why the Fair Pay for Home Care Act should be viewed as economic development. So based on a study done by the City University of New York, the net economic gain of passing the Fair Pay for Home Care Act would be at least $3.7 billion. That would also lift the wages and help fill nearly 20,000 vacant home care positions each year. And it would create about 18,000 jobs in other industries by boosting local economic activity. So currently, about 42% of the state's home care workers live in or near poverty. And the Fair Pay for Home Care Act would lift over 200,000 home care workers out of poverty wages, which, you know, when you think about things like childcare and home care, I mean, can you think of any more important a job than, you know, taking care of our children, taking care of a loved one? And these, you know, home care allows people to stay in their homes, which helps local economies more than most economic development programs ever could. And I would just add on to that too, higher ed, in particular CUNY and SUNY, should be viewed as economic development as well. I mean, when you think about, you know, nearly 80% of CUNY graduates stay in New York. They earned a combined $57 billion in 2019, paid an estimated $4.2 billion in state income tax, and represent 10% of the state's private workforce in New York. So, you know, very clearly, you know, these types of services should be viewed as economic development because they have a direct impact on local economies, to the benefit of local economies. So I think it's important to note all of those factors, and I'll leave it at that, if that's okay, Peter, unless there's something else you want me to touch on. You are on mute, Peter.
Yeah, thanks. We'll have plenty of time to circle back with questions, but I'm going to now move to Dee Dee, who's going to make her case for children.
Oh, that's quite a challenge. Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Ron, and Rachel. So, I'm going to talk a lot, but quickly, about childcare. But before I do, I just want to acknowledge where Ron left off, sort of talking about home care, the home care workforce, and sort of the whole caring economy. A lot of what I'm going to say in the next few minutes about the childcare workforce is going to sound really familiar, because it really is that the childcare workforce is facing the very same challenges that the home care workforce is facing. And, you know, it's an incredibly gendered issue. It's a racial justice issue, because most of these workers are women. Most are women of color, dramatically underpaid, and without them, our communities and our economy and our families would fall apart. So, you know, there's just this long history of their contributions being undervalued, and that's something that really needs to change, and urgently so. So just two things about me. I'm Dee Dee Hill, Policy Director at the Schuyler Center for Analysis and Advocacy. And the Schuyler Center, we're based in Albany, but we, for 150 years this year, I have to say that, it's our birthday, we have been advancing policies to improve the lives of low-income New Yorkers, with a real focus on children and families. And I'm also here as a proud member of the Empire State Campaign for Childcare, which is New York's statewide campaign that is dedicated to bringing universal childcare to New York State. So I guess before I jump in, here's what I'm proposing I'll do, and I'm gonna try to cut it short because I think it's much more interesting for us to just talk. But first of all, I just want to make the point that, childcare really is a quintessential economic development issue. And I think that this moment, as we're trying to recover from a 2-year-old and persistent pandemic, it's ever more clear. Childcare challenges are keeping parents, particularly women, out of the workforce at a time when we know New York employers and employers around the country are desperate for employees. And at the same time, due to years of insufficient public investment, the childcare sector, which is itself made up of small businesses in communities all over the state, the sector is faltering. The pandemic challenges have led to widespread childcare closures. Some were temporary, some turned into permanent closures because they went into the pandemic with no fallback, nothing to cushion the economic challenges that they faced. And there's no question that the childcare challenges are undermining the speed and the strength of New York's economic recovery. So that I feel like my job is done here, right? I've made the case childcare should be treated as economic development. But let me let me talk just a little bit about some of the bad news, some of the challenges that New York families and the sector face, and then I'm going to talk about how I think this really is a moment of opportunity in New York, and then give a sense of what the Empire State Campaign for Childcare thinks is the way forward. So first of all, this I don't think will be news for anybody on this Zoom, but childcare is and has long been unaffordable for almost all New York parents. The high quality childcare, while the numbers vary around the state, the costs are extraordinary. So average cost is more than $2,000 a month for a family who have, if they have 2 children in childcare. And yet, almost all New York families have to cover these costs entirely on their own. And that is because the principal means of public support for childcare comes in the form of childcare subsidies. And due to years of underfunding and a lot of other systemic challenges, fewer than 20% of families who are eligible for subsidies can access them. And even for those families who are lucky enough to access a subsidy, if their income is low enough, there's also there are many other barriers to accessing subsidies, including work requirements. There are whole groups that are excluded from subsidies in many communities. So for instance, and this is very relevant right now, in many communities, parents who are looking for work can't access childcare subsidies. And so you can see how that would make it very hard for a parent to get back to work if they're trying to conduct a job search while caring for children. It's also the case that many immigrant families are blanket exclusion from access to childcare. And also many parents who are seeking job training or a college degree in order to improve their economic stability. So lots of challenges with the child care subsidy system. And then the other piece, so even though the cost of childcare is out of reach for almost all New York families, even with these high tuition costs, they fall far short of meeting the true costs of providing high quality childcare. Because, appropriately, it costs a lot to take care of our little ones. And so what that has left childcare providers who recognize they can't ask their families to pay anymore. They end up paying themselves and their staff, often near poverty wages. So the average median wage for a childcare staff in New York is $30,000 a year. New York's early childhood educators, they live in poverty at more than twice the rate of New York workers in general. And as I mentioned earlier, these are the same challenges that are facing our home care providers and other members of the caring economy. And then at the same time, the economics of childcare have led many providers to close their doors or reduce their capacity. During the pandemic, New York has lost more than 9,500 licensed childcare slots, and that number is a little bit old. More than 1,500 childcare providers closed their doors between April 2020 and February 2021. And that's significant because we went into the pandemic with 64% of New Yorkers living in what we call childcare deserts. So those are communities where there really is no care to be accessed. So we started at a tremendous deficit, and that deficit has only grown. So the bottom line, treating childcare as a private service rather than the public good that it is, it was a flawed model long before the pandemic, even more so now. So, all right, I'm going to quickly to some good news. And I think there is some, and this really, I think this is a moment of opportunity. First, the pandemic has brought significant awareness nationally in New York to how essential childcare is to the economy, to communities, to families. And it's also brought attention to how broken the system is. You just have to open the newspaper, and there are articles about childcare every day. This is the challenges of childcare. Have any family who's dealt with childcare costs, childcare challenges, has known this for many, many years. But it's become more broadly understood, particularly by business, who have seen their productivity fall when parents who have had to juggle remote work, remote school, remote work, and caring for young children, and they can't do it all. Other positive news is, and why this is a real opportunity for New York. New York has resources right now to kickstart transformation. We have, the higher than expected state revenues. New York received $2.4 billion in federal stimulus funds that were earmarked for childcare. Many of them have been less, I would say, anyway, a good portion of those funds are still left. And I could break it down for you if anyone is interested. And while that is not all that we need, these funds, well invested, could really take New York a long way down the road towards universal childcare. And then I'm going to end with this. This is the way forward. The way forward is that New York State needs to invest $5 billion this year in childcare, and those funds need to be invested in a way that, as I said, allows New York to take large steps toward creating a high quality, free, equitable, and universal childcare system. And the system needs to meet the needs of all children, all families, and it needs to include strong supports and a thriving wage for workers and childcare providers. So I'm going to stop there. Great. And I'm happy to answer questions or just continue with the conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Dee Dee. We have about 10 minutes for questions. If I could, I want to get as many as we can. So if you could, be brief and just ask a question, that would be great. So as many people as can be able to participate. So questions for our panelists here.
Can I ask the question, Peter, quickly?
Yes. Yeah.
So why have we not, don't know if you all have also engaged with the other parties. I'm looking at Rachel particularly. Rent subsidized, rent would help. But why don't you all bring the landlords in and the banks in, because the banks are charging the landlords have to pay the mortgages, and everyone is suffering from during this pandemic. The bank should reduce their fees, for instance. So I'm just wondering if there's any been connection with the other aspects involved. Thank you.
On rental assistance, or sorry, the emergency rental assistance program, the arrears, COVID related, there definitely was coordination, on the landlord side as well, and advocacy in Washington. So we do talk to those groups. The banks have a harder time getting involved with lobbying activities, but the landlords have been speaking up. But I think you're right to point out it doesn't feel like a coordinated and unified force all the time. And there often are very opposing views between the tenant-oriented groups and the landlord-oriented groups. But where we can bring them together, we do.
Okay, great.
Yes, I have a question for Dee Dee.
Yeah.
The foster care system, how's that doing? The reason why I'm asking that, because I'm concerned because everything has multiplied and you don't hear anything about the foster kids.
Yeah, that's a big question. That's a big question. But yes, I think so when we think about disenfranchised populations, yeah, families, children involved in the child welfare system are really among those with the least voice. And I think there's some good news in New York around sort of the child welfare system. There was a federal law passed a few years ago called the Family First Preventive Services Act that New York was a little slow to implement, but it's going online right now. And the principal aims of that law are to direct more federal funding and drag along more state funding for preventive services. So supporting families before they fall into crisis and get themselves, get engaged with the child welfare system. And then also even and supporting foster. So in those cases where a child does need to go into foster care or kinship care, that family-based foster care is given all the supports they need so that we keep as many children out of congregate care or group homes, because there is no question that that institutional settings are the worst place for a child to grow up. And so I think there is some right sizing and some important work going on in that arena, but there's a lot more to be done. And I will just say one other thing about childcare and the intersection with foster care. One thing that under our current childcare subsidy system, counties have an option to give subsidized childcare to all foster parents, regardless of their income and other, they don't have to work. And because of insufficient funding, a lot of counties don't do that. And that is one of the barriers. We don't have enough foster families in New York. We don't have enough kin who are able to step up and care for kids in their families that they want to care for, but they just don't have, sufficient resources and support. And one thing that would one barrier that we could remove, and we could remove it right now, is make sure that all foster families and all families in receiving preventive services, so, are working to keep their families together, they should all get access to free childcare, because that is that really is a preventive service. It keeps families together and helps keep families healthy.
I'm just going to ask a question, and any one of you could probably pick up on this, but the governor has said with this additional money that they've received that they're proposing a COLA, cost of living increase, and a bonus, but it really seems like a very tepid proposal to what's really required. But it's a little confusing about what workers are affected by this proposal from the governor, and what impact we could have on who if we were to be much more ambitious in terms of wages.
I'm sure I'll jump right in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, for the first time in a very long time, a COLA is on the table, for instance, for the human services workforce, right? That's the workforce that the state contracts with private nonprofits to provide services on behalf of the state. That workforce had not received a COLA during the entire decade of the Cuomo administration. So I would suggest that 5.4% is woefully inadequate at this point, and more needs to be done to lift this, workforce out of poverty. It is predominantly women, half women of color, and it has been undervalued and underpaid for far too long. And I think, they need more than a 5.4% cost of living adjustment. And I really do think we need to be looking at the wages across the board in the caring economy sector. They're just grossly underpaid for jobs that are probably the most important jobs in our economies. So yeah, I think, while I applaud the governor for making these investments, I would say it's not enough yet. So we need to keep pushing on that.
Okay. Rachel, I have another question for you. The question around the accessory dwelling units and zoning. I was intrigued by your observation that outcomes for children are improved if they can, go into a higher income kind of neighborhood, not radically so. But it seems like this accessory dwelling unit law would help facilitate more diversification within our neighborhoods. Could you say more about that? And there's also some criticism of it that's coming, worried that it's going to hurt single family home kind of communities.
Yeah, that's nonsense. There's so much pushback, right? Anytime you want to make changes around zoning, people get very defensive. They don't want to see changes to their neighborhoods. They don't want to see the character of their community change. But that's also why we have exclusionary zoning policy right now, and we can't build enough affordable housing because we're just not allowed to, right? Across the state, we have so much single family zoning in place that you can't even make room for your mother-in-law or your adult child, or, you know, get extra income as you retire and you want to rent out, you know, a apartment in your garage or some kind of accessory dwelling unit. So there are barriers right now to do that in many parts of the state. And Governor Hochul put forward legislation that would require localities to adopt an accessory dwelling unit law, permitting accessory dwelling units with some minimum parameters. You know, certainly in some parts of the state, they're not going to be realistic, or they're not going to work, whether that's, you know, infrastructure challenges around sewer lines, or whether it's lot size. You know, there are going to be some barriers, but, you know, our position would be that we should be doing everything we can to create more housing in New York. And this is one of the easiest ways to do it. I don't think it's just going to solve our affordable housing crisis in any way. It might actually be that we see accessory dwelling units created that are still not affordable at all. It's going to be a homeowner that has the means to invest and create that accessory dwelling unit, and then, you know, how they want to use it is going to be up to them. In New York City, it could allow for some of the basement apartments that right now are illegal apartments to have a pathway towards legalization with safety upgrades, which I think would also be, you know, a huge win. So, you know, I think it is a controversial proposal just because there are many suburban areas that have come out strong against any changes. But, you know, those are the same neighborhoods where we don't have housing opportunity and people are locked out right now.
Peter?
Yeah, we just have, oh, go ahead. Anybody else?
Yeah, I had a quick question for Dee Dee.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Fred.
My experiences in Connecticut doing advocacy work on childhood issues, we went round and round, and they no longer allowed me to talk about it as childcare, but they define it as early childhood education. And they spent an awful lot of time and energy trying to position this as not babysitting, which is what is implied by childcare in the broader public. Have you guys had to wrestle with that?
Yes, in fact, we have. I think where we have ended up, when we speak about the workforce, we often talk about them as childcare educators. I think there is some different, you know, I mean, names and titles matter a good deal, of course, but many of the providers in our campaign, they embrace the title at childcare, but definitely also think of themselves as educators. So, but I definitely hear you, and there's no question. And all of our conversations and what we are seeking in expanding access to universal childcare is it's universal, high quality childcare. All kids deserve and need high quality childcare, and the educators are incredibly skilled professionals, and they should be recognized as such.
One of these days, under Peter's tutorship, I'd like to sit down and talk with you and share some of the experiences, as I was on the board of the Early Childhood Education Collaborative in Connecticut.
That would be great. Connecticut's doing great things around childcare, so I think you had a good influence.
We even had an ombudsman.
Yeah, okay.
I have a question for Didi. Can I ask you one question, please?
Sure. One more question. Go ahead.
Yeah, please, Didi. I want you to explain more about the investment of 5 billion this year, and if it doesn't come true, what will be the impact?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think 5 billion is what we really need, and we really need it to you know, for years, what we have experienced, including in this year's executive budget, is where there are a few small addition, you know, new investments. They're really just band-aids on a broken system, and that's really just not enough. And where we're actually getting to a moment where we're putting money into a system that is broken, and that's not good policy, and doesn't serve anyone well. So so it's hard. So there is, I try not to like speak in, you know, exaggerate, but we have the childcare sector is crumbling. So if we don't get really substantial investment this year, I think a lot of providers are not going to come back from the pandemic. And just for one example, one reason that we haven't had a complete collapse is because the federal government did recognize the dire situation of childcare around the country. And in the American Rescue Plan Act, the last federal stimulus package, New York received we received, I think, 1.2 billion. We got a lot. Actually, we got more than that. We got 1.8 billion from ARPA, and 1.1 billion of that went to stabilize the childcare sector. And so in 6 months, the state, this is actually a real success, and then the state should get credit for this. The state got $900 million out to individual providers all across the state in 6 payments. They made it easy. They made it accessible. They did a really, really good job. And those checks are running out right now. So providers have gotten them for like the last 6 months. And, you know, in the next couple of months, they're going to run out. And then providers are going to be in exactly the same place that they were. So we haven't had the crisis yet because we got this relief, but the crisis is coming if we don't do it, because nothing fundamentally has changed. So they're in exactly the place they were, you know, 6 months ago. So.
Okay, folks, we're going to have to wrap it up. I would love to talk with you guys all afternoon if I possibly could. But we do need to move on. So thank you, Rachel, Dee Dee, and Ron, for a great presentation. And we are now moving to our next set of seminars.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.